Very good afternoon to all. On behalf of the Department of English, Rampur Girls College, I, Dr. Shuranjana Bhadra, Head of the Department of English, welcome you all and convey my heartiest greetings to the Chief Patron of the webinar, Dr. Shoma Roy, Principal, Sirampur Girls College, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Shayunti Talukdar Mukhopadhyay, our esteemed resource person, honorable, honorable faculty members of other institutions, and Srirampur Girls College, our YouTube viewers, and my dear students. In order to facilitate academic exchange among the teachers and the students during this time of the pandemic, we, the Srirampur Girls College faculty, have taken the initiative to organize a series of webinars by all the departments one by one. In tune with this mission, the Department of English is hosting this webinar on the topic English Renaissance Drama, Contexts and Readings in collaboration with IQAC, Srirampur Girls College. English Renaissance drama is a very important part of both the UG and the PG curricula, and therefore our speakers today will provide us new insights and will open up new areas of exploration. We are greatly honored to have two eminent academicians with us today. Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta, Associate Professor and Head of the Department of English and Culture Studies, the University of Burdwan, and Dr. Siddhartha Biswas, Associate Professor, University of Calcutta. May I now request Mr. Shirshak Ghosh, Faculty Member of the Department of English, to conduct the webinar. Over to you, Shirshak Ghosh.
Thank you, Madam. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shirshak Ghosh, a faculty member, Department of English, Srirampur Girls College. To begin the inauguration session, I would like to request the Principal of our college and the chairperson of the webinar, Dr. Shoma Roy, to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, Madam.
Good afternoon, everybody. Respected resource persons, Dr. Siddhartha Biswas, University of Calcutta. Respected resource person, Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta, University of Burdwan. Respected college teachers, scholars, and students joined in this webinar. It is my privilege to extend my sincerest welcome to all of you in this webinar on English Renaissance Drama Contest Reading. Before the outbreak of COVID-19, our teaching and learning was made dependent on chalk and talk method. That is our traditional classroom teaching. Fear of COVID-19 has made us confined in our house except some urgent need. Countless lives and livelihood has been destroyed, and we see that crisis is picking up pace. We are also trying to keep pace in this new normal period. Both teachers and students are being accustomed with online teaching and learning. We are also joining in webinar, video conference, online courses to continue our academic activities. Hence, we should treat this virtual platform because we may hear speeches from eminent persons who usually remain busy with their academic work, and they may not be able to physically appear in our college for a seminar, like today's resource person. It seems that organizing webinar is more convenient than to organizing seminar in our college. I express my sincerest thanks to Dr. Siddhartha Bishwas and Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta for having them within us in this webinar platform to deliver their valuable speeches. I hope a very fruitful and enlightening discussion in this webinar. The students will be benefited very much as this topic covers some part of their syllabus. I wish a grand success of this seminar. At last, I wish good health and sound mind for all of us in this COVID-19 pandemic situation. It is our great belief that we can overcome this disaster by forwarding our cooperation and love for each other. Thanks to all of you for joining in this seminar.
Thank you, respected Principal Madam, for welcoming our guest. May I now request the IQAC coordinator of our college, Dr. Shayanti Mukhopadhyay Talukdar, to say a few words about the webinar. Over to you, Madam.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you, ma'am, you're audible.
Good afternoon, everyone. As the coordinator of IQAC, Srirampur Girls College, I take pleasure in welcoming you all to this webinar on behalf of the principal of our college, Dr. Shoma Roy, IQAC members, webinar committee, the Department of English, and all other professors and staff of our college. Department of English, in collaboration with IQAC, has organized a one-day state-level webinar today. The topic of the webinar is English Renaissance Drama, Contexts and Readings. We have two eminent scholars, speakers with us, Dr. Siddhartha Bishwas, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Calcutta. He will be speaking on deconstructing Shakespeare, reading the unread. We also have with us another scholar, Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta, Associate Professor and HOD, Department of English and Culture Studies, the University of Burdwan. This topic is dramatic genres in the English Renaissance. I extend to you both my heartiest welcome. Your enriching words on this topic are sure to enlighten the students, the research scholars, as well as the teachers. Whatever has been lost, rather destroyed due to COVID-19 pandemic, causing devastation all over the world, putting an end to the normal life that we were so accustomed to, are now being restored gradually, getting ourselves used to the new normal. What feature normal is replacing classroom studies with the online classes and seminars with the webinars. Our college too does not remain behind in this aspect of getting itself used to the new normal. Hence, we have started a series of webinars. Online classes are there, of course. Today, we are extremely happy. Our college is going to host one such webinar on English literature, the chosen field being the English Renaissance drama. The English critic, Walter Pater writes, the Renaissance of the 15th century was in many things great rather by what it designed than by what it achieved. The English Renaissance was a cultural and artistic movement in England dating from late 15th to the early 17th century. It is associated with the pan-European Renaissance that is usually regarded as beginning in Italy in the late 14th century. Elizabethan era in the second half of the 16th century is usually regarded as the height of English Renaissance. English Renaissance theatre is English drama between the Reformation and the closure of the theatres in 1642 after the Puritan Revolution. It may also be called early modern English theatre, which includes the drama of William Shakespeare, along with many other famous dramatists. Renaissance theatre was characterized by the features of the medieval theatre tradition, such as one, mystery plays. They were during the Middle Ages. Secondly, the morality plays, which evolved out of the mysteries. And thirdly, the university drama that attempted the tragedy. Anne Sullivan Macy writes, every Renaissance comes to the world with a cry, the cry of the human spirit to be free. The term Renaissance, French for rebirth, was never used during that period. It was invented in the 19th century historians, and its remit is still hotly disputed. It throws open an array of questions. Does this term Renaissance describe the social, cultural, historical, economic moment, or was it a gradual process? And if so, when did it end? Did man really re-find himself, as one French historian later wrote? Or does this term Renaissance signify something much subtler, something more indefinable? Questions can be many, but the answer is one, the true revival. Yes, it was the revival of the art, of the high culture, all under the influence of the classical models, though they had their own distinct forms, their traditions, and their art forms. I end with a quote by E. Merrill Root. We need a renaissance of wonder. We need to renew in our hearts and in our souls the deathless dream, the eternal poetry, the perennial sense that life is a miracle and a magic. I sincerely hope this webinar turns out to be extremely fruitful, informative, and an enriching session. Thank you, scholars. Thank you, eminent speakers. And thank you, my dear audience, for your patient hearing. Please stay safe, stay happy. All my sincere wishes for everyone present. Thank you again. Namaskar.
Thank you, madam, for your warm deliverance. Now, I would like to request the head of the Department of English, Dr. Suranjana Bhadra, to introduce our first speaker.
How was it?
Thank you.
Thank you, Shirsha. I am privileged enough to introduce Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta, who began his career in the academia in 1999 and is presently Associate Professor and Head in the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Level 1. He is passionate about Shakespeare and the European Renaissance, and his doctoral thesis, for which he received his PhD degree in 2006, was titled Genre and Meaning in Shakespeare's Histories. He is a member of the Shakespeare Society of India and has earlier been member of the British Shakespeare Association. His other interests include 18th century British literature and culture. Besides, Dr. Sengupta loves poetry, theatre, and sport. He is an artist to the core, a wonderful painter, a fantastic photographer, and an excellent commentator. So I request, sir, to begin your lecture. Thank you.
Sir, your mic is off, I guess.
Oh, yes. Sorry
we
about
cannot
that.
hear you,
Yes.
sir.
Now I've set it right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, sir. Please go.
A very warm good afternoon to everyone. And I must thank the college, Shirampur Girls College, for having invited me. I feel privileged and honored to be here and to be able to address all those who have logged in to listen to Siddhartha and me speak today about the Renaissance. Now, I'll make a presentation, so I'll request you to check if the slides are appearing on screen, and that'll take about a minute's time if things go well. I'm just trying to set it on screen. Just one moment.
No, sir.
Yes.
No, we cannot see. We cannot
yes,
see it.
give me a moment. Just give me a moment. I always have this problem.
Shishak. Yes, madam.
Just a request to all the participants. It would be kind of you if you could switch off your cameras.
Just give me a little more time. I'm trying to bring it onto the screen. Can you see this on the screen, the title page?
No.
No, sir.
Not yet, sir.
All right, I'm trying to bring it there. If something is going wrong, just give me half a minute. Now I think you can see it.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
That's absolutely fine.
It's visible, sir.
But is this the entire screen or is it only part of the screen?
No, it's the entire
Entire
screen.
skin. Entire skin is.
All
The
right,
entire
so-
screen is visible, sir.
All right. So let's get along then. I'll be speaking about dramatic genres in the English Renaissance. And this is a subject that has not perhaps received the kind of attention that it ought to deserve. There are not too many books available on the subject. There are quite a few, but these are not very readily available. And that's a pity because there was so much of engagement with theories of genres and with particularly different kinds of drama during the Renaissance. There was so much of intermingling of different dramatic genres and modes. There were people arguing against that sort of intermingling. And there were people who were able to see the bright side, the advantages of that sort of intermingling. And there were two kinds of drama that were born during the Renaissance. One was the English chronicle play, which evolved into the English history play, and the other was tragicomedy. Of course, as this presentation will try to establish, there were a few other kinds of drama as well that came into being during the Renaissance. Now, genres keep evolving. They are not static. Genre terms, tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy, total tragedy, romantic comedy, even romantic tragedy, and there are so many others. These genre terms are subject to historical variation. The lack of continuity between the way these genre terms were understood in the 16th century during the English Renaissance, the way genre categories were formed during that time, and how the same genre terms have begun over the centuries to have different implications and meanings and connotations is exciting. The same genre categories for centuries now imply things which they didn't imply during the English Renaissance. And this leads to certain difficulties in reading and comprehending older texts generically. Now, since one important function of genre is to govern and shape our understanding of a literary text and to govern meaning, change, threatens to be potentially disruptive. The point is, had a particular meaning during the English Renaissance, or a particular meaning during the classics. And now tragedy means something else. One has only to read Raymond Williams's book, Modern Tragedy, or a couple of the essays by Arthur Miller to understand what tragedy means today and how it's different from the way tragedy was understood in earlier centuries. So this sort of change threatens to disrupt not only our understanding of the genre, but also invites us to face our responses to older. The genre evolves as it keeps getting molded by writers trying to strike a balance between tradition on the one hand and individuality and popular demands on the other. During the early modern period in England, the rhetoricians of the time, theorists of as that the most significant of all the literary genres. But of course, today we'll be talking about the different dramatic genres of the English Renaissance. Now, let's stay with him a little longer. He argued each genre has a proper place and function. I believe that some of the students here will be familiar with Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, and even if they have not read it in full, some of the things that Sidney says in An Apology for Poetry, and Sidney genres, he doesn't quite attempt formal definitions of genre, but he talks about the social effects of genres instead. And Sidney seems to believe that various genres. Later, of course, in the course of this presentation, I'll try to suggest literary texts do not, in a sense, belong to genres. But as a matter of speaking, sometimes we loosely say that a certain text belongs to the genre of comedy or to the genre of the epic. Now, Sidney believes genres, or for that matter, the different genres themselves, to the audiences their proper roles, social roles of the audiences, and the faults of the audiences. Tragedies, for example, are mostly about kings, emperors, and of high estate, and concern matters related to the nation. Tragedy may reveal to kings and to their subjects the dangers, for example, of tyranny, of ambition, or probe issues regarding the health of the state under a particular monarch. Remember those lines from Macbeth, which Ross relates when he travels to England. New day, new widows howl, new sorrows strike him on the face. Now, seen from this point of view, tragedy not only about universal suffering on a large scale, but also is, in a way, obviously related to politics, as a warning to kings and tyrants. Sidney's theories are derived from the Aristotelians and from Senecan drama. Senecan drama exerted considerable influence on Renaissance playwrights. And Seneca's tragedies were declamatory and rhetorical and sententious, had a considerable influence, not only in but several countries of Europe from the very early years of the European Renaissance. Roger Ascham, Sidney's predecessor in Renaissance literary theory, however, was an exception. There were a few exceptions like Ascham, and Ascham, for instance, was inclined more towards Greek playwrights, such as Sophocles and Euripides, rather than towards Seneca. Sidney, on the other hand, upholds the virtues of Gorboduc. And Gorboduc, as we know, is a tragedy, perhaps the first in the English language, modeled in certain respects on Senecan tragedy. And Sidney upholds the virtues of Gorboduc as a tragedy, and the only flaw in that play, as Sidney sees it, is that it does not observe the unities of time and place. Now, Sidney is a close follower of the Italians in believing that the most perfect tragedy not only imitates a noble action, but also stirs, evokes admiration and pity while representing some noble action. Among ancient literary works, Plautus's Amphitryon is a play that approaches the genre that Giambattista Guarini, I'll talk about Guarini later. He was an Italian playwright of the late 16th century. And this play by Plautus, an ancient Roman play, Amphitryon, is a play that approaches tragicomedy, which is a kind of drama that Guarini is credited with having invented during the Renaissance. But the ancients, unlike the dramatists of Renaissance England or early modern England, never go to the extent of sometimes crudely bringing together festivities and melancholy, or hornpipes and funerals. Now, not all Renaissance dramatists do that. Shakespeare never does that. Whenever Shakespeare brings together the tragic and the comic, he blends them in a way that suits his thematic purposes. But there are certain plays written during the English Renaissance where the intermingling of different literary kinds is crude. Spinjon, a literary critic writing towards the close of the 19th century, wrote a book called A History of Literary Criticism in the Renaissance, and this was published first in 1899, and of course had later editions. It was a very important book for its time. And there, commenting on Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, Spinjon writes, Sidney's censure of the contemporary drama is now, he's explaining why Sidney is not too fond of the drama of his own time. And Spinjon says Sidney's censure of the contemporary drama is that it outrages the grave and weighty character of tragedy, its elevated style, and the dignity of the personages represented by mingling kings and clowns and introducing the most inappropriate buffoonery. The English dramas are neither true comedies nor true tragedies, and disregard both the rules of poetry and honest civility. Tragedy is not tied to the laws of history and may arrange and modify events as it pleases, but it is certainly bound by the rules of poetry. So this is a sort of assessment of Sidney's argument in his Apology for Poetry that Spinjon recreates or offers us in his book, A History of Literary Criticism in the Renaissance. Now, comedy, on the other hand, is a genre that warns the audience to stay away from any mode of conduct that may be understood as ridiculous. And after their doubtful beginnings and troubled early scenes, comedies, through certain lucky turns of events, end in a manner that provides joy and appeases everyone concerned, the characters on the stage, and of course the audiences as well. Now, it is therefore essentially a theatrical representation of the common behavior of men. And our common inclination is to look forward to happiness, to look forward to happy endings of all our troubles, and comedies provide that sort of ending after, as I said, doubtful beginnings and troubled early phases. And comedies also, instead of focusing on the lives of kings and the states of nations, comedies focus generally on the manners of private and ordinary persons, sometimes, of course, dukes and earls, but generally also of peasants and very ordinary people. Now, there was a certain abuse. I have put abuse with an inverted commas in the slide because I'm using the word in a very specific sense. Now, we're talking here about the abuse in Renaissance England or early modern Tudor England of tragedy and comedy. And this abuse was, in a sense, very real. And Sidney, for example, denounces the reduction of contemporary comedy to low and rough farce, which makes comedy that is incapable of providing anything more than passing, fleeting laughter. And what he wants for the English stage is a more intellectual kind of comedy, resulting in a delight that would be lasting, that would satisfy its audiences more deeply. And he draws a distinction between laughter and delight. To him, laughter is only a scornful tickling that's momentary and superficial. Delight, which is very different and which Sidney considers the ultimate end of not only a comedy, but of also tragedy and of true art, as a matter of fact, is a permanent joy, is a more permanent kind of joy. Thomas Campion, in a book published in 1602 called Observations on the Art of English Poesy, fights a lost cause. He fights a lost cause for the application of classical meters and forms to English verse. And he speaks of assigning specific meters to individual literary forms. This issue, however, is not taken up at all by most theorists of the period. So what he was trying to say is that sonnets should have a particular meter, epics should have another kind of meter, or tragedy should have a particular kind of meter if it's written in verse, and most tragedies of the time were indeed written in verse. Comedies could have a slightly different kind of meter. That is what he was implying, but that was not an issue that was taken up for discussion by most of the theorists and rhetoricians of the period. It's also remarkable that several critics and literary theorists of the English Renaissance discuss a wide range of literary terms, ranging from lyric poetry to the writing of history, that are not accommodated in Aristotle's credo, his central credo of mimesis or imitation. So the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that the English theorists of the Renaissance have agenda, have preoccupations and engagements that may be thought of as having evolved since the time that Aristotle wrote his literary theory back in classical Greece. Several Renaissance discussions of poetics have genre as an organizing principle, as well as a primary preoccupation, which makes it all the more surprising that there is not too much of available literary criticism today on the genre theories that were prevalent during the Renaissance. As I said, there's only a handful of books that are useful and available, but not as many as there should be. There is, for example, a book called Renaissance Genres, which is a collection of essays edited by Barbara Lewolski, and there's a book called The Resources of Kind by Rosalie Coley. But these are only two of, as I said, a very scanty number of books that have responded to the need of writing about Renaissance genre theory. This preoccupation with genre theory during the English Renaissance stems, number one, from an increased interest in classical writing about genres, particularly the writings of Aristotle and Horace. And secondly, this also stems from the eagerness of English writers to establish the respectability of their own language. This is important. The English writers were trying to write things in the English language, trying to establish its respectability thereby. And they were trying to write things which had been written about in the classical world and also were being written about in other European countries, notably in Italy. English to these writers was a language to be taken seriously. And in keeping with this seriousness, an elaborate system of rules had to be formed, just as elaborate as the system of rules which characterized Greek and Latin writing. However, the rhetoricians of the English Renaissance are also quite flexible in their adherence to generic rules, even as they try to go back to classical Greece and Rome and dig up the ancient works of Aristotle and Horace. And even Ben Jonson, for all his classicism, in his discoveries, he, while criticizing the schoolmen, it's nothing, the schoolmen, they were medieval, a group of medieval theologists. And Ben Jonson is criticizing the schoolmen here, students who have read Bacon's essay of studies. Must have been familiar with the term schoolmen, since Francis Bacon uses the word there. And Ben Jonson, in his book Discoveries, while criticizing the schoolmen, writes, "Nothing is more ridiculous than to make an author a dictator, as the schools," that is where the schoolmen studied, "have done with Aristotle." Now, he's saying that the schoolmen have taken Aristotle for granted and have followed him blindly and uncritically. For to many things a man should owe but a temporary belief and a suspension of his own judgment, not an absolute resignation of himself or a perpetual captivity. So a writer, says Ben Jonson, should owe to an ancient writer only a temporary belief and a suspension of his own judgment, but he should never resign himself absolutely, perpetually, to whatever has been said in the past. Let Aristotle and others have their dues, let us respect them, but if we can make further discoveries of truth and fitness than they, why are we envied? So Ben Jonson is prepared to go a further distance than had been traveled by Aristotle and Horace. Now, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, Polonius offers us a famous allusion to various dramatic genres that were prevalent during the English Renaissance. Of course, there's a bit of satire in what Polonius is saying, and we'll come to this a little later. The attitude expressed by Jonson, as is evident from the passage I quoted, translates into actual practice in much of Elizabethan writing. And there is a proliferation of dramatic genres beyond mere tragedy and comedy, which are the only two genres that were handed down to Renaissance Europe by the ancient classical world, whose guardians and inheritors and interpreters the Renaissance rhetoricians and humanists fancied themselves to be. Now, the fact that there was this proliferation of literary genres during the English Renaissance is very strongly hinted at in Hamlet by Polonius's famous catalogue of dramatic genres. We'll come to this in due course. Besides the strongly independent manipulations of genre that we notice in Shakespeare particularly, and in his contemporary writers, there's a work like Spenser's Faerie Queene, among the better known works of the Renaissance, other than those by Shakespeare. And it's significant how Faerie Queene combines elements of epic with those of romance. And I mentioned this here just to give you an indication of what to expect in Renaissance drama, where this kind of intermingling of genres, which is in a sense rather unclassical because it affects the purity of generic kinds. And the fact that there is such a thing happening in the Faerie Queene gives us an indication of how much more vigorously this sort of intermingling takes place in Elizabethan or in English Renaissance drama. Now, English society was mobile, and the flexible approach to genres in the English Renaissance may have been vindicated by the social mobility and fluidity that was encouraged during the period. Long before the Renaissance, the classical rhetoricians of Greece and Rome, by so frequently talking of the concern of tragedy with men of high estate and that of comedy with characters from the lower strata of society, had firmly established links between the literary genres, or the hierarchy of the literary genres. In this case, the hierarchy that involves tragedy and comedy, with tragedy at the top and comedy at the bottom, and social systems on the other hand. The Renaissance in England witnessed a substantial improvement in the financial and social positions of the middle class. They were already on their way up, even during the 16th century, which of course was something that became very, very visible in the 18th century. But this was something that started in the 16th century itself. And even Queen Elizabeth, we are told, had a predilection for choosing her civil servants from the middle class rather than from the aristocracy. A number of Renaissance writers also, following the lines set by the classical rhetoricians, suggest parallels between literary and social classes. In Discoveries, the book I quoted from a little while ago, in Discoveries, for example, Ben Jonson says that epic demands more space than other literary forms in much the same way as a king's house demands more space than a peasant's house. Sidney respects the generic prescriptions of the classicists, but does not blindly and thoughtlessly imitate them. He argues that a dramatist must follow the unities, not only because Aristotle has said so, that cannot be the sole reason, but more importantly, because it is sensible to follow the unities. Similarly, while opposing the practice of mixing genres, Sidney also asserts that rather than an unthinking adherence to tradition should be our guide in the matter of either mixing genres or not mixing them. On mixing genres, Sidney observes that there is neither decency nor discretion in the manner in which some contemporary Elizabethan dramatists have been mingling kings and clowns. And he's referring, of course, to those predecessors of Shakespeare who were doing this very, very crudely, just for the sake of it. And he's also saying that there is neither decency nor discretion in the way in which clowns are thrust in to play a part in matters related to kingship and in matters of the state. Of course, if he had seen King Lear at the time that he was writing an apology for poetry, he wouldn't have said the same thing of the fool's role in King Lear, because the fool, as we all know, is integrated into matters related to kingship and matters of state. However, Sidney is liberal, more liberal than is generally supposed, and a close reading of an apology for poetry will tell us so. And he seems liberal on the general issue of blending serious and comic matter, and appears to make allowances for certain circumstances when the plot may demand the presence of both kings and clowns. And he therefore is not really advocating in every case a very strict separation of the tragic and the comic. His censure, we must remember, is directed specifically towards such blending of serious and comic elements as may appear ill-timed and indecorous. He condemns the forced intrusion of comic elements upon grave and serious matters, or the thrusting in of clowns to play a part, as I said earlier, in the matters of kings. That is what he is censuring. Now let's talk a little bit about Jacques Derrida. Let's come down to the 20th century and let's see what he says about genre. And we'll go back to the English Renaissance in a while. Genre indicates a kind of codification. And this sort of codification constitutes a norm in relation to which individual literary texts may be produced and perceived. Now, when certain properties keep coming back in a number of texts, this recurrence becomes institutionalized. The properties become codified, and genre, essentially, is this codification of discursive properties. Now, one characteristic feature of genre, therefore, is the identifiable recurrence of a common trait by which one may easily recognize a text as corresponding to what we may call a class, a category. And Derrida, writing in an essay called The Law of Genre in 1981, says, a text, now this is very significant, and what I'm going to talk about in the next 5 or 6 minutes is something very nuanced, as I try to present before you some of Derrida's arguments and thoughts on genre, particularly on generic markers such as comedy or tragedy or tragicomedy, which are generic markers. And let's see what he says about that. But first, this short passage from the essay. A text would not belong to any genre. Every text participates in one or several genres. There is no genre-less text. There is always a genre and genres. Yet such participation never amounts to belonging. So, while a text may participate in one or more genres, a text cannot be said to belong to a genre. And not because of an abundant overflowing of a free, anarchic, and unclassifiable productivity, but because of the trait of participation itself, in marking itself generically, a text unmarks itself. If remarks of belonging belong without belonging, then genre designations cannot be simply part of the corpus. But the language, as you understand, is confusing. And I'll not try to dissect it now for want of time, but you will have this slide to look at later. And as you do that, you will be able to get to the bottom of the idea that Derrida is foregrounding. Now, we'll talk a little further about Derrida. Derrida wonders whether what he's saying here in that passage essentially is whether one may classify a work of art, especially discursive art, such as a play, if it does not carry any generic signal. A generic signal is the generic marker. Tragedy, for example, is such a signal or a marker. Now, he is arguing that no text belongs to any genre. A text only participates in one or several genres. And the irony lies in the fact that that text, while marking itself generically, say if we say the tragedy of the second, that's what I'll be talking about a little later, I'll be citing that play as an example, then the tragedy becomes a generic marker. Now, in marking itself generically, this play also simultaneously unmarks itself from other generic markers, such as romantic comedy and whatever else you may think of. Marks that suggest belonging, according to the reader, these markers, tragedy, actually belong without belonging. Marks that suggest belonging, all right? Now, tragedy as a marker suggests that the play, Richard II, that I'm talking about, although Hemming and Condell in the first folio thought of it as a history play and not as a tragedy, and it's only in the title of the quarto edition of the play that it was called The Tragedy of Richard II. Now, that's a different issue, but suppose we have such a title, The Tragedy of Richard II. Now, the marker there, tragedy, seems to suggest that the play belongs to the genre of tragedy. But what it actually suggests is that the play belongs without really belonging to the genre of tragedy. It doesn't belong to the genre of tragedy. It only participates in the genre, in the expansion of the genre of tragedy, as more and more plays begin to be added to the category, the class of the genre. Now, the reader's arguments seem to indicate that genre, although necessary, is unstable. Because there can be several kinds of plays that could be accommodated, for example, into the category of tragedy. It's a flawed system. And the fact that it's a flawed system was quickly established in the English Renaissance itself, when Hemming and Condell, while publishing the first folio in 1623, disregarded the title of Richard II in the quarto and categorized it as a history play in the table of contents, and removed from its title the first few words, the tragedy of. If a generic marker like the tragedy in the tragedy of King Richard II indicates membership of a set or of a class, it cannot, while indicating that membership, itself be part of the set whose boundaries it demarcates. Now, this is a very nuanced observation that the reader makes. He says that the words, the tragedy, can only indicate membership. But while indicating membership of a set or of a category, it cannot itself be part of the set. So the marker remains outside the set. It only indicates that the play may be pushed in, as it were, into that set. The tragedy, therefore, is only a generic marker, but not a feature to be found either within the set or within the play. It's only a marker, and such generic markers, therefore, are not wholly inside or wholly outside texts. They exist in a blurred boundary, as the reader says, a generic boundary between the concerned genre itself and the set of other genres. All right, now this is not very easy to understand at one go, but since we will have the slide to look at later, I believe that further readings will make the thing clearer than it is probably at the moment. The generic markers suggest, therefore, that a text participates in one or more genres without, I repeat, actually belonging to that genre or to those genres. Now, this implies that no text can ever very straightforwardly be described in generic terms. And this brings in the idea of generic instability. We cannot call generic terms unreliable in spite of that and discard them simply because it is not possible to describe texts in straightforward generic terms. The generic markers or the generic terms, the generic signals, nevertheless have their own utility. The generic terms govern, for example, to a large extent, our reading and interpretation of a text. They help to draw lines of demarcation, send important signals, and raise expectations among the recipients of a text. The reader's argument, however, may be challenged by asking what remains in a genre after we have excluded from it the generic markers, and have assumed that the generic markers exist only as a blurred boundary separating the concerned genre itself from the set of all other genres. And the reader's own argument that generic markers are neither found wholly inside texts nor wholly outside texts is also questionable. It's a debatable, provocative argument. Now, the reader seems to conceive of all generic markers as designators of genre. We may reason that a genre is never quite successfully described by the generic markers or designators. And in doing this, we may differ a little from the reader, and we may say that a genre is better described by the rules about it contained within itself, rather than simply by the generic markers. And thus, what makes a play like the tragedy of Richard II tragic are all those features, characteristics that cause the play to conduct meaning in one set of ways instead of in other sets of ways. And it's not simply an outside term like tragedy, a generic marker that makes the play tragic. The features which cause a text to conduct meaning in one set of ways at the expense of another combine to form the category of the genre. Now, this category, therefore, is the sum of, or is the aggregate of certain discursive properties, which, instead of lying outside the text, are the very features that give the text its existence and meaning. On the other hand, the generic markers, according to Derrida, lie outside the text. They are meta-discursive. Now, when we look back at Shakespeare from a distance of over 450 years today, we realize that he did not really bring to life on the Elizabethan stage the classical prescriptions of Aristotle and Horace. He did not write within the prefabricated conventions established by those classical writers. And yet, in a play like Richard II, a play that does not quite adhere to the Aristotelian concept of tragedy, and whose protagonist is a very different kind of person from the kind of tragic protagonist that Aristotle recommends. In a play like Richard II, Shakespeare uses elements of tragedy, which in the Renaissance was a recognized generic form. In Richard II, Shakespeare is not writing within a genre, but the play is not outside genre either. In our attempts to understand genre, we tend to impose limits, norms, and interdictions, and we emphasize the need to respect and to stick to a norm and not cross certain established boundaries or risk impurity and anomaly. Genres, we generally suppose, should not intermix. And even when we talk of genres intermixing accidentally, we still tend to think that such intermixing only confirms the essential purity of the identities of the concerned genres. And therefore, we talk of intermixing in the first place. Now, this is because, as the reader says, we are after all only talking of mixing. And what can we mix other than pure forms? Genre, by definition, therefore, is related to the concepts of limitation and demarcation, and its chief function is to separate one kind of text from other kinds of texts. In practice, of course, genres can indeed be mixed, as indeed they were during the English Renaissance, and this is what causes genres to evolve and change into new forms. This is what we call a tendency towards hybridization, which would involve modification by another generic term, combined with the tendency of genre terms to be subject to historical variation. And this only establishes the truth that genres are flexible. And more than genre itself coercing a writer or a text, it is the writer or his text that seems more often to be shaping genres and to be shaping our ideas and understandings of genres. And this phenomenon has been very noticeable in English literature, particularly since the English Renaissance. Not only were literary kinds like tragic comedy established as new genres, the earlier genre terms also began now to have newer, revised meanings. Most Elizabethan texts, and many texts since the Elizabethan period, do not remain fully within one single genre throughout, and they show a tendency towards modification and hybridization. Polonius, and this is what I was referring to some minutes ago, gives us what appears to be a list of modular dramatic genres. And modular is a term that derives from mode. And for a slight distinction between mode and genre, I recommend Alistair Fowler's book, Kinds of Literature. And Polonius talks about the different kinds of drama in the Elizabethan period: tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral, comical, historical, pastoral, tragical, historical, tragical, comical, historical, pastoral, scene indivisible, or poem unlimited. This is from Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2. Now, there is probably a satirical side to this sort of pedantry on the part of Polonius, and he may be satirizing the practice of generic distinctions in general, and he starts with 4 apparently pure genres. Let's have a look again. He starts with 4 apparently pure genres: tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral. And then he begins to talk about the hybrid genres: pastoral, comical, historical, pastoral, tragical, historical, and then things begin to become more complex: tragical, comical, historical, pastoral. He almost quite exhausts the possibilities of hybridizing them, missing out possibly on the comical historical hybrid. And this is strange, considering that Shakespeare himself, before writing Hamlet, had written plays such as the first part of Henry IV and Henry V, which may be seen as comical historical plays. Now, the English chronicle play and the English historical play, or the English history play, are interesting because the chronicle play and the history play developed in Renaissance England towards the close of the 16th century, and the chronicle plays were very simplistic dramatizations of historical events. And early English chronicle plays included an anonymous play called The Famous Victories of Henry V, which was one of the major sources for Shakespeare's Henry V. There was a play by George Peele called The Life and Death of Jack Straw, and another, which was also probably by George Peele, we are not very sure, The Troublesome Reign of King John of England, which was one of the sources for Shakespeare's play King John. And there was an anonymous play called The True Tragedy of Richard III, which again was one of the sources for Shakespeare's Richard III. And the genre of the chronicle play, with time, but very quickly, evolved into the mature history play, with plays like Christopher Marlowe's Edward II and Shakespeare's 10 plays on English history. History plays do 2 important things. They point to the past as a lesson for the present. And secondly, they assume the presence of a national consciousness in the audience. And the English history play flourished in times of patriotic zeal between the 1580s and the 1630s, following the victory by the English naval fleet over the invading Spanish naval fleet called the Armada in 1588. And the history play, therefore, is arguably the most English of all dramatic genres. It's a genre which was born during Renaissance England. And by the 1630s, however, the English history play was out of fashion, as is stated in the prologue of John Ford's play Perkin Warbeck, 1634. It's 1634, that's a mistake in the slide, which itself was a history play from the Caroline period. The history play has never been easy to define, certainly not as easy to define as tragedy and comedy. Shakespeare's earliest editors, Hemming and Condell, obviously believed that the histories constituted a genre different from the tragedies and the comedies, and this explains their grouping of the plays in the table of contents in the first folio into histories, tragedies, and comedies. Nicholas Rowe's early 18th century edition of Shakespeare's plays rejected the history plays as a dramatic kind, and Rowe thought that Shakespeare's plays could properly be distinguished only into tragedies and comedies. And even Samuel Johnson thought that the history plays were very amorphous, but he accepted the genre of the history play as an inferior Elizabethan genre. And in his preface to Shakespeare, published 1765, Johnson says that a history might be continued through many plays. As it had no plan, it had no limits. Of course, one of the features of the history plays is that they are open-ended, and one play leads to another. Coleridge saw the history play as an intermediate form between the epic and the drama. Now, the division of Shakespeare's plays by Hemming and Condell into histories, tragedies, and comedies suggests Hemming and Condell's disagreement with the titles of the plays, of many of the plays, that is, in their earlier quarto editions. The quartos had identified Richard III and Richard II as tragedies, and the titles of these plays in the quartos had been The Tragedy of King Richard III and The Tragedy of King Richard II, as we have noted. Henry IV and The Taming of the Shrew contain the term history in their titles, while Hamlet is called a tragical history. Henry V and King Lear in the quartos were seen as chronicle histories, and the complete titles of these plays in the quartos were The Chronicle History of Henry V and The True Chronicle History of the Life and Death of King Lear and his 3 daughters. In the first folio, The Taming of the Shrew, Hamlet, and King Lear are not, however, histories. The Taming of the Shrew is a comedy, and the other 2, as we know, are tragedies. The grouping of the plays into histories, comedies, and tragedies in the first folio is the product of the independent thinking, therefore, of Hemming and Condell. Now, let's talk about Giambattista Guarini, and in a play called The Faithful Shepherd, which was written in Italian in 1590 and translated from the Italian into English in 1602, the Italian playwright Giambattista Guarini attempts to combine tragic and comic elements in one single play. And in late 16th century Europe, when he wrote this play in 1590, Guarini gave birth to one of the major literary and aesthetic controversies of the time by challenging the integrity of genres defined by Aristotle. Readers of Hamlet today generally fail to realize that Polonius's list of dramatic genres was a very relevant and timely literary joke for the Elizabethans in the context of the kind of intermingling of dramatic forms that was taking place and the extent of deviation from classical prescriptions that was taking place. Guarini had started work on The Faithful Shepherd almost 30 years before its first performance in Mantua in 1598. Much of the play is standard comedy. We have a number of mismatched lovers, a father who interferes, and a young man who is more inclined towards hunting rather than to wooing women. In spite of this adherence to some of the general and accepted features of comedy, we find that things are upset in the 4th act, where we have, so to speak, a breach of decorum, when one character is wounded and another sentenced to death, and things suddenly turn grave. In a comedy, critics saw this as a vulgar error. Guarini, for his part, insisted that he had deliberately brought together, amalgamated elements of tragedy and comedy to create the new genre of tragicomedy. Tragedy gave Guarini the great persons, but not its action. A plot that is credible, but not historically true. Emotions which are stormy and violent, and yet tempered. Its delights, but not its moments of sadness. And the threat of danger, but not death itself. From comedy, Guarini borrowed laughter that is not dissolute, He borrowed simple and modest pleasures. He borrowed a fictional and feigned crisis, and he borrowed an unexpected and happy reversal at the end. Above all, he borrowed an essentially comic plot. In his essay, Compendio della Poesia Tragicomica, published in 1601, Guarini makes a distinction. This was an essay by Guarini where he makes a distinction between the tragic hero, which he calls la persona grande, and the proper subjects of comedy, ordinary private persons. A grand person for the tragic hero, and persona e negozio privato, private, ordinary persons for comedy. A reading of this essay, Compendio, would indicate that Guarini is demanding a mixing, a fusion of the fundamental and contrasted features of the two genres of tragedy and comedy. Among the English writers, John Fletcher, under the obvious influence of Guarini's The Faithful Shepherd, wrote a play called The Faithful Shepherdess, probably in 1609, and he called it a pastoral tragicomedy. Before Fletcher's play, however, there was John Marston, who wrote a tragicomedy for performance by a boy company called The Children of the Chapel. And this was a play written for performance at the Blackfriars Theatre, which we all know was a major private theatre during the Renaissance in England. And the play was called The Malcontent and was written between 1602 and 1604. In The Faithful Shepherd, Guarini, it has to be said, had ultimately succeeded only in bringing in some of the dark incidents of tragedy, some characteristic dark incidents of tragedy in a predominantly comic plot. By contrast, The Malcontent bears greater resemblances to plays of dynastic politics, such as Hamlet and Richard II, or Macbeth and King Lear. As in these plays, here we have a virtuous ruler who is deposed, and there is, of course, King Lear is not deposed, but he gives away his kingdom. And in The Malcontent, not only is there a virtuous ruler who is deposed, there is a progressive moral corruption of the state under the usurper. There is an evil traitor called Mendoza, and he emerges and tries to seize power by having the new duke murdered. And there is tragic intrigue, but set against that tragic intrigue is the comic intrigue centered on the old banished duke. The banished duke comes back to the court disguised as a satirist. And the gentler politics of comedy, therefore, temper and balance the harsh and dark dynastic politics of tragedy. This is a genre, tragicomedy, where the dramatists usually send the deposed rulers into exile, as Shakespeare does with Duke Celia in As You Like It. However, As You Like It never approaches the darker elements of tragedy closely enough to be called tragicomic. In plays with predominantly tragic elements, the deposed rulers are usually put to death, as in Shakespeare's Richard II and Hamlet, where Hamlet's father is put to death, and Marlowe's Edward II. In a tragicomedy, after the banishment of the deposed ruler, the plot generally develops by empowering the comic elements over the tragic. The same happens in The Malcontent, where the conclusion of the play sees the usual restoration of order as Duke Altafronto, the banished duke, wins back his throne. In such plays, the tragic situation is finally upset, and the audience is able to reinterpret the tragic situation as a kind of disruption in what is essentially a comedy. The comic plot is supposed to typically reverse the disruption, and that is precisely what the comic developments do to the tragic situation in The Malcontent. The narrative material of The Malcontent is borrowed by Middleton's Phoenix, John Day's Law Tricks, two other plays of the time, and of course by Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. Now, these plays are essentially dark comedies. Measure for Measure is also generically classified as a problem play. But these plays are essentially dark comedies that use the central plot devices of disguised dukes, political displacement, and averted murder. They resist generalization, and it is difficult to conveniently accommodate them in any generic category. The malcontent not only saw the genre of tragic comedy develop out of late Renaissance Italy's literary and aesthetic experiments, it also started the gradually increasing application of overtly tragic material to comedy. Look at Twelfth Night, for example. The playwrights, aware of the blurring of genre categories in their plays, often called attention to this phenomenon in the prologues or epilogues of their plays. The Merry Devil of Edmonton, an anonymous play first performed at the Globe in 1602 and published in 1608, and once assumed to be a Shakespeare play, begins as a farcical sequel to Dr. Faustus. The prologue underlines the juxtaposition of the tragic genre material of Dr. Faustus with the comic material of the Merry Devil of Edmonton by asking the audience to wait for, I quote, the comic end of our sad, tragic show. Plays which effectively combine tragic and comic elements might have been dismissed as vulgar, mongrel drama, but tragedy with its excessive melancholy and comedy with its excessive lewdness may not seem any less vulgar on careful consideration. And therefore, seen from a certain perspective, a tragic comedy is a more tempered and gentle and polite form of drama, well suited to the tastes of the aristocracy, and well suited, therefore, to the tastes of the Blackfriars Theatre, which was a private theatre frequented by noblemen and aristocrats. The audiences of the Blackfriars Theatre probably had a sense of their own gentility, and this gives rise to a rather uncertain and dubious theory that the Blackfriars Theatre, where the tickets were priced as much as 5 times higher than in the public theatres, and where the audiences were of a socially higher rank and were better educated, and mostly from the aristocracy, the theory is that the Blackfriars Theatre itself was largely responsible for beginning and establishing the genre of tragicomedy in England. But this is a rather uncertain and dubious theory, as I told you. Returning to the hybridization suggested by Polonius, we may note that Polonius's generic terminology may have something to do with the play, that's Hamlet's, or Hamlet the character's general difficulty of knowing things precisely. So that inventory, that list of dramatic forms, may suggest a certain kind of uncertainty about the world, and it may point towards the play's own difficulty in knowing things precisely, or Hamlet's own difficulty of knowing things precisely, to be or not to be, the availability of options, Hamlet's awareness of the inadequacy of language to pin things down, may also be indirectly suggested by Polonius's comic classification. And it needs to be remembered that generic labels enjoyed great popularity and currency in Shakespeare's time, and the value and validity of hybrid genres, like those mentioned by Polonius, were the subject of numerous serious literary debates. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your illuminating lecture. Indeed, we learned a lot from what you have said, and most of these things were unknown to us, and definitely we will be taking back all these to our classrooms also. Now, I just move on to Shirsha. Shirsha, over to
Yes,
you.
yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, sir, for your excellent presentation.
Thank
And
you very
now
much.
the session is open for the interaction session. I would like to request my faculty member, Dipayan Dr. Rai, to proceed with the interaction. Over to you, Dipayan, sir.
Thank you, Shishapra. Thank you, Professor Sengupta. It was quite an amazing session. Obviously, an enlightening one. Uh, we will have to move on to our chat box to receive to take some of the questions we have received so far. But before that, I will share something that I myself feel personally after listening to your lecture. I remember what the famous American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson said, that eloquence is something that shows the power and possibility of man. And today, Renaissance, which is broadly our topic today, I believe from the little bit of it I know, that Renaissance was also about the power and possibility uh, of man, the possibility to overcome all the hurdles, hardships, uh, of the and all the challenges that ever a man is made to confront. And today, in this what I believe to be a time of confrontation, uh, once again your lecture, your brilliant ruminations made us realize that the power of eloquence itself can truly empower the possibility of man, even in our time. So thank you once again. As our departmental head, Professor Dr. Suranjana Bhadra, said that many of the things that you spoke about were previously unknown to us. Thank you for enlightening, for uh, for enriching all of us. Thank you. And now, without any
Pleasure.
further delay, I will move on to the questions that we have received in our chat box. So there is the first one from Shahib Koyal, whose question is there any specific stage setup for different genres of play of Renaissance? The question is not so much clear to me. Maybe
I think
Professor Suboji can go.
yes. I think I understand what the question is trying to imply.
Yes,
Um,
over to you, sir.
yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's an intelligent question. Now, the Elizabethan stage, the Renaissance stage, was, if you look at the public theatres, such as the Rose or the Fortune or the Globe, the Swan, and these had large stages. And we know the structure of the stage in Shakespeare's time. It had a balcony, and there was a balcony above the first balcony. There was a tiring room. There was a trap door. There were two doors at the back of the stage, the exit and the entrance. And the audience, we know, sat on three sides of the stage. We know the basic structure of the stage. And the structure was such as could accommodate any kind of drama. So there was no necessity really of having a particular kind of stage setup for tragedy, another for comedy, another for a history play. And in any case, when we are talking of mixing genres in the Renaissance, there's a book called Shakespeare's Mingled Drama. This is common knowledge. It doesn't really take a new book to tell us that Shakespeare mingled genres and modes in his plays. Now, since this was so rampant and so frequent and so commonplace in Renaissance England, this matter of mixing genres, architects of the time would have had sleepless nights preparing different kinds of stages for different kinds of plays. So the fact of the matter was that there was this large public stage in the public playhouses, and the structure of the theatre itself and the structure of the stage, with all its components, with all its material components, was adequate enough to accommodate all genres, mixed or unmixed. That's it.
Thank you, sir. So next we have one, I would say, an observation and then a question. So first the observation, it's from Uma Rai Srinivasan, who wrote, "Thank you, Professor Sengupta. for lucidly explicating the limitations and dangers of branding the plays of Renaissance period into generalized concepts of genres. The plays of the time are properly speaking inside and outside a genre. So, would you like to say anything, sir?
Not really. I mean, I could add to what I've already said, but then I could go on and on. And there's no end to talking about this, since there are so many different kinds of plays and such a wide variety of plays. Just to give one example, just a short little example. Take, for example, a play with which all students here are familiar, students in today's gathering. Take a play such as, but if you take a play like Christopher Marlowe's Edward II, the history play, if we take that to be a genre, and tragedy, if we take that to be a genre, exist together in a fine balance. Neither of these two exist in a modal form. Forms. It's their entire range of features. So these markers, when we talk of the markers, forms. It's their entire range of features. So these markers, when we talk of the markers, comedy, tragedy, history play, these markers are words, signals, labels, and they exist outside the plays. What exists inside, or what exist inside the plays, or within the plays, are the features, where the implications of the markers, the suggestions of the markers, are worked out and given shape and allowed to prosper. All right, so that is how the generic markers exist outside.
Questions. So the next one is from Oitrik Dr. Choudhury. His question is it at all possible to do away with genre boundaries, or is it really a loop where we delimit one to move on and create newer ones?
I will not recommend doing away entirely with genre boundaries. I think genres are essential. There was a time some 20 or 30 years ago when the question of the legitimacy of genres was being debated. But now I think there is a renewed interest in genres, and there has been a relatively recent book published around 10 or 12 years ago in the New Critical Idiom series it's a book by John Frau, an Australian, and it's a book called Genre. This book, the fact that it was published only as recently as 2009 or 8, if I remember correctly, is an indication that the interest in genre and genre theory today is still a legitimate interest, and publishers are willing to publish books on genre. So there is a renewed interest in genre, and this is a pointer to the need to have these generic boundaries understood, even as we also realize the necessity to occasionally mix boundaries and to dilute boundaries, mix genres, that is, not boundaries, but to dilute the boundaries. And this is necessary because only such a process, such an exercise, can help genres to evolve and new genres to come into being. Tragicomedy wouldn't have ever come into being. Historical tragedy or pastoral comedy would never have come into being had the Elizabethan playwrights not thought of going beyond Aristotle and Horace. All right.
All right. So the next question is from Rajesh Patro. Diversity of genres and their amalgamation in literary text somehow makes the meaning of a text somewhat ambivalent. What's your take on this, sir?
Yes, and the more ambivalent the meaning of a text, the richer it is. Text gains, I would argue, by virtue of its ambivalence. And yes, the uncertainty about generic labeling, an uncertainty which arises from the intermixing of genres, the mingling of different genres and modes, complicates and problematizes meaning. And that indeed is one of the happy effects I would say, of this sort of hybridization of genres, not unduly severe or strict on the practice of intermingling genres. He was averse to the idea of crudely, indiscreetly mixing genres. But he understood that occasionally there would be the necessity of mixing genres. He was too sensible a person to not understand that necessity. Now, both Sidney and Ben Jonson were classicists, and they were writing in an age which tried to fancy itself as the inheritor of ancient classical wisdom, but also at the same time was going beyond the strictures and the rules of ancient classical composition. Now, the two things were happening simultaneously. And if you read Sidney carefully, and if you read Ben Jonson carefully, and these are seminal texts which I mentioned, Sidney's Apology for Poetry and Ben Jonson's Discoveries. And if you read these carefully between the lines and try to get to the bottom of what they're saying, you'll find that in spite of being classicists, they are leaving some space, so to speak, open for flexibility with regard to new practices, with regard to practices which are meaningful and which could carry literature in the English language, mind you, that's important for both of them, which could carry English literature in the English, or which could carry literature in the English language forward and make it capable of competing with literature in the other European languages, ancient and modern. So they were not really averse to the idea of meaningful intermingling of literary genres. And since the question was about Sidney, I'll say once again that Sidney only opposed what he called a crude intermingling of the comic and the tragic when that was not really necessary. Some playwrights were doing it simply for the sake of it, but that was done very, very crudely. And that is what Sidney did not like. As to whether his contemporaries were angry with him for what he wrote in an apology for poetry, I'm afraid I have no evidence to say that they expressed their anger in ways that have been documented. I have no evidence to tell me that. All right.
Thank you, sir. I think we are going to take one last, or maybe more than one, two questions. Shoma Mondol, she has asked, sir, would you like to say a few words on Umberto Eco's On the Name of the Rose?
I haven't read that book. Sorry, but I haven't read that book. But since you have asked me that question, thank you for the question. I'll have a look. I'll read the book now that you have asked me the question and try to find out what possible responses I could have to it.
And the next question is once again from Shahid Koyal. Is there any standard markers to mark a play as tragedy or comedy or any other genre?
No, by marker, what I meant was the labeling, the words in the title. If you say The Tragedy of Richard II, the words The Tragedy in the title are the generic markers, or is the generic marker for the play. Now, not all plays have such words in the title. Macbeth is simply called Macbeth in many editions of the play. So a play may not have such a generic marker. If it doesn't have that kind of generic marker, it could still be in Shakespeare's own time during the Renaissance, announced with a generic marker. On days preceding the first performance in the public playhouses, people would go about the streets loudly announcing the production, which would take place very shortly. And while making such announcement, a generic marker like tragedy or comedy could be used, even if such a word were not there in the title. The comedies generally do not have generic markers. We do not say a comedy called As You Like It or the comedy of Twelfth Night. We don't say that. But then, As You Like It, of course, in the Comedy of Errors, there's the word comedy in the title itself. But if you say As You Like It, Twelfth Night, or What You Will, then there is something about these titles, A Midsummer Night's Dream, there is something about these titles which, The Taming of the Shrew, there is something about these titles which vaguely, in a very abstract form, suggest a generic marker and tell you that what you're going to see is a comedy. First of all, the fact that these titles are general titles, the titles don't bear the names of individuals, which is what tragedies do. Tragedies always have the names of individuals in the titles. So also do the history plays. But the comedies, you will notice, have very general titles. That itself becomes a kind of marker for comedy. Otherwise, one has to look for features of comedy. The features of comedy, the characteristics of comedy, which, going by the reader's argument, are inside the play, within the play, unlike the markers, which are there outside, partly outside the play, because they're there in the title, partly, not wholly, partly outside, because something of that spills over in the in the unfolding of the characteristics. Something of the title, something of the generic marker spills over. If you think carefully, you will find that what I'm saying is complicated, but it's true. And when that happens, when something of the title spills over into the contents of the play, the characteristics of the play during performance or during your act of reading, you realize that these features are recognizable features of a certain class, a certain codified form of drama. And when you see that there are features of other kinds of categories as well within the same play, you then realize that there has been some intermingling of genres and modes. That's it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for kindly answering all of the questions that we received. And
It's been a pleasure.
I think, thank you. The pleasure has been all ours. And I will now request our head of the Department of English, Srirampur Girls College, Professor Dr. Suranjana Bhadra, to move on with the rest of the proceeding for today's webinar. Put to you, Professor Bhadra.
Thank you, Deepayun. Thank you, Shubhajitda. Now it's time we move on to the next session. Now, Paramita, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Suranjana Di. Thank you, Deepayan, and thank you, Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta sir, for the informative session. Now, for the next session, I would like to request our senior most faculty member, Dr. Purnisha Pita, Associate Professor of English from Srirampur Girls College, to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Siddhartha Vishwas sir. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Paramita. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely, ma'am. You are absolutely audible.
Thank you. Our next speaker in this webinar of the Department of English is Dr. Siddhartha Vishwas. Dr. Vishwas is currently an associate professor in the Department of English, Calcutta University. All of us know this, and I'm privileged to introduce him. Thank you, Shuranjana, for giving me the chance to introduce Dr. Vishwas. Dr. Vishwas has taught in the Department of English, St. Paul's Cathedral Mission College, for 17 long years before joining the university. His doctoral work was on the screenplays of Harold Pinter. He has written a number of articles in reputed journals in India and abroad. And I recall that he contributed a very important article on drama in our departmental journal, The Impression, and which came of great use for the students. Till today, they refer to it extensively. Dr. Vishwas's books include, and he has written a number of articles that I have already told, and his books include Theatre, Theory and Performance, published by the Cambridge Scholars Publishing House in UK, and Looking for Home Journey and Boundary in Postmodern Texts, published by the Atlantic, New Delhi. He has also translated a number of works, among which his translations of The Merchant of Venice and Twelfth Night may be mentioned. Both are published by Monfokira. I have also gone through another translation, which is not referred to here, that is Four Plays by Harold Pinter, which Sir had given to me. I've gone through it, very nice. His areas of interest include postmodern theatre, translation studies, and popular culture. Over to you, Dr. Siddhartha Bishash.
Thank you, Shurmishthadi. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, yes.
Yes, sir.
Uh,
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Yes.
all right. Let me begin by thanking Srirampur Girls College for asking me to speak here. And let me also thank Shurmishthadi, thank Shuranjana, and all my friends in the department for giving me this opportunity to speak here today. And my presentation would be nothing like Shubhajit's presentation. Shubhajit's presentations are always very erudite and fascinatingly explorative of whatever issue he is looking at. So I am not going to do any such thing. I am just simply going to do a kind of a popular kind of a lecture, as my title told you, that deconstructing Shakespeare, reading the unread. It's a lean kind of a paper. It's not overtly theoretical or anything. So and I do not have a presentation, unfortunately. So let me just start. Because, see, when Shuranjana asked me about the Renaissance, there are so many things to say about the Renaissance, particularly Renaissance theatre. And then I spoke with Shubhajit, and when he said that he's going to present on the genre idea, I thought that he would be very, very comprehensive, as he always is. And incidentally, one of the things that was not, Shubhajit, I don't think whether you know about this or not, Shubhajit had played King Lear himself. So his understanding of Shakespeare is, Renaissance theatre is quite good. I mean, theatre is one thing. Unless you are involved in theatre, it becomes very difficult to appreciate the nuances and appreciate how the stage works. And incidentally, I was thinking of saying, offering my gratitude to the IQAC coordinator, because on her speech on the Renaissance, she, I think, set the stage quite brilliantly, so that we all have much less work to do here. But let me start talking about my presentation, this thing. See, Shakespeare, whenever we talk about Shakespeare, what do we talk about? I mean, do we always talk about the plays? Do we always at all talk about the man? Or do we talk about this kind of an idea? Because believe it or not, or I mean, we know that Shakespeare has been probably the most revived, adopted, stolen from, and whatnot. So many. I mean, Shakespeare still lives in a way. And with or without acknowledgement, so many reinventions, representations, as I said, revivals. In our, we kind of adapt his plays to suit our ideas. He can. It's a very interesting thing that he can get into any time. His texts can get into any time and can be kind of appropriated by contemporary needs. So this is something that has fascinated me. And Kolkata is a city which has a Shakespeare colony, which used to be Theatre Road. So it's not very far away from theatre. It was never very far away from theatre. But Shakespeare has been used by propaganda. Shakespeare is always a part of canon. Not all of Shakespeare. Parts of Shakespeare are parts of different canons. Uh, there are so many canons and a variety of canons, and you will always find a bit of Shakespeare everywhere. So this is the thing. And if you think about Shakespeare adaptations, let me get into this discussion through a recent, not very recent, but a recent adaptation that all of you might be familiar with, Maqbul. Because when Vishal Bharadwaj was doing Maqbul, he was doing it as an adaptation of Macbeth. So, it's wonderful to see that even after 400 years, this is a play that still has currency. And when Vishal Bharadwaj is acknowledging this, that I am reworking, reinventing, or adapting simply Macbeth, there are several things to think of. Why? Why is he acknowledging? Is it simply because of artistic integrity or honesty? Or is it because there are marketing possibilities, there are commercial possibilities? Because if you say that I am adapting Shakespeare, then you get a whole new or segment of the audience interested. Because Vishal Bharadwaj makes great films. Most of his films are great, and he has his own niche audience. He has his own variety of cinema, his own artistic brand. But when he is incorporating Shakespeare, he is very, very aware of the fact that the box office will profit because people who are interested in Bharadwaj will come, people who are interested in Shakespeare will come, people who are interested in criticizing everything will come. Because when you are making a film, you face a lot of criticism, and when you are adapting Shakespeare, the criticism grows by leaps and bounds. So your audience will exponentially grow. So this is the idea. And whenever we say this thing about uh, Shakespeare, what I kind of feel that Shakespeare is less of a dramatist. Now, Shakespeare is much less of a canonical figure in that sense, but he is much more of a brand, much more than a single author, but he is a brand in more ways, perhaps, as we will try to look at it. And this brand, when you say that you are being faithful to the text, you are being faithful to the author, but the author's authority we are challenged were actually written by the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. And because a nobleman could not be associated with theatre, he could not present his plays himself, but he wanted his work to be presented. So in the film, we see he's approaching probably Johnson at the beginning, and before Johnson can decide, this man, this actor, minor actor even, not a major actor, this minor actor called William Shakespeare, is jumping to the opportunity, and he is appropriating these pages, these manuscripts, and he is saying that I have written them. And in the film, it is shown that this particular William Shakespeare is illiterate. He cannot read or write, but he takes the manuscripts, he takes the credit, and a whole lot of other things happen. But that is not quite important for us. So Shakespeare, there are so many conspiracy theories, but there has been court cases challenging Shakespeare's authorship. Court cases even in recent times. I'm not during the Renaissance, but even in recent times, there have been court cases. There have been judgments that this is something called a moot court. It's not an actual court, but the judges come. There are actual judges who give a judgment on a certain thing, and they say no, the Earl of Oxford was not the actual author of these plays, actual dramatist. So, and it's all available on the internet. You can just look it up. Even Wikipedia will tell you about all this. So, what is interesting then, that when somebody says we have this habit, I mean, even though we live in an age where we have managed to kill the author, the death of the author is something that we kind of believe in, but still we historically place a text, and we historically place the text along with the author, along with the dramatist, along with the company. This is how we even contextualize a text. Age where we have managed to kill the author, the death of the author is something that we I mean, not all texts but still we can have historically such freedom. But we keep saying that I am reading Shakespeare. What are you reading? And what is in your syllabus? Shakespeare. And that seems like a satisfactory answer. Along with the author. In case of Shakespeare, as I said, if we accept Shakespeare as a brand, then I am reading Shakespeare becomes quite, no, not a bad kind of answer, not a bad kind of statement, because you are eventually reading a brand. You are not, there is no authority. And see, with the dramatist, along with the company, this is titled my presentation as deconstructing Shakespeare. Managed to kill the author is not the man, but all but still we can have brand. So before I go on to my next section, let me just give you some information. What we know about William Shakespeare. And you will see we know only a little bit. What we know is that he is the third child of Mary and John Shakespeare. He was baptized as Gulielmus Filius Johannes Shakespeare. William is far better name, if you ask me. Already we have, our students have so much difficulty, and if they had to write that name, it would have been quite a nightmare. And he got married to Anne Hathaway in 1582. And he had to take a special permission because Anne Hathaway was 6 years older than him. He was, 8 years older than him, because he was 18 and she was 26, I think. I mean, you would say, what is the problem there? But in those times, this was an issue, and they had to have a church, a permission taken from the church. Now, in that record, in the marital record, the name that we will Mum Shakespeare, Shaxpere, and the bond that he had to give for marrying Anne Hathaway for the permission, the name is William Shakespeare, Shagsper. Of course, at those times, people were not really bothered about spelling as such. I mean, they were very happy times, in fact. So, but the problem is, even when he is signing, we don't really have similar kind of signatures. We don't have any signatures on manuscripts. None of the manuscripts are attributed to him as such. What we have is later official publications which have his name. So what we have, in fact, his manuscripts would be copied, they would become prompt books, and they would be pirated, because other companies would be very interested in obtaining these plays so that they can play them in other regions of England. This is piracy, and some of them would be printed. And you know about the history of the quarto and the folio editions. So that much is there. But none of these manuscripts carry his name. So the only books that do carry his name are the two books of poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. These are the two books that carry his name. They had 8 editions. So they were highly successful books. They were bestsellers, in fact. And I'm sure Shakespeare, whoever Shakespeare is, earned a lot of money from that. And I'm sorry about that. So, and the manuscripts were not published as such at times because the manuscripts did not sell. So the authors, the dramatists were not interested in publishing their work because they would not sell. And so We have his signature on certain legal documents. We see that he is signing in some. But then again, apart from those two books of poetry, we don't really have works by Shakespeare at that time. As the actor, there are records, but as dramatist, these all come later. So it's very interesting that these plays that we have did not have a contemporary attribution. They were later on attributed to Shakespeare because of the availability of certain manuscripts which later on were published. And very interestingly, he was at the zenith of his success. And in 1611, he is disappearing from the London scene, and he is going back to Stratford upon Avon, and he is going back to his business, the business that he had been running all the time by proxy. His So we have this brilliant dramatist, the super hit kind of a dramatist, who is simply disappearing one fine day and not coming back, and there is no reason. Nobody can tell us why. I mean, he might have been scared of the plague. He might have been afraid of. There were a lot of fires, not only the Great Fire of London before that, but there were a lot of fires. He might have, come to insult some. But anyway, if it wasn't for Irfan Khan, I mean, this idea of humanizing the criminal, that has been going on for, that's a different politics altogether. But the problem is, Maqbul cannot become a tragedy. Maqbul cannot become Macbeth. And, I have been talking about this, I have been thinking about this for a long time. But then again, one day it kind of hit me that perhaps that is exactly what Bharadwaj is trying to say. In fact, it made sense to me only after I saw Haider. So this is Shakespeare appropriated. This is Shakespeare reinvented, as I said, to suit our times. So he is not being faithful to the core Shakespearean textual or philosophical idea. He is just rereading Shakespeare in a different way. But I am going to reread in another way. Because my rereading would try to look at certain issues that these plays might be presenting, but they are being neglected by the performance, they are being neglected by canon, and they probably are being neglected by the academia as well. But I don't know. I mean, a lot of people might be reading these same things. But my point is, these ideas are equally valid in contemporary times. When Shakespeare was writing, these readings would be valid. These readings would be valuable because what they will show is the other face of the Renaissance. Because we kind of always celebrate the Renaissance about humanism and everything, and we tend to forget that Renaissance was full of racialism. There was slavery. There was witch hunting. Slavery was abolished much later in England. I mean, this is a thing that English history very cleverly does not mention. I have asked many of my friends from the history departments that when was slavery abolished in England, and they cannot really answer very quickly. Most of them, I mean, some of them have enlightened me. But the Renaissance is not all hunky-dory kind of a thing. There are also a very dark side of humanity, of humanism, of the Renaissance. So in a way, these readings often look at how Shakespeare may have included those ideas in his plays. So not only celebrating, but also looking at this negative side of things in his tragedies and in his comedies. One of the reasons I believe that Shakespeare has survived so much, I mean, His plays are sensational, his plays are violent. But then again, we have Kidd, we have Marston, we have Middleton who are writing such plays. But hardly anybody who does not know, who has not been unfortunate enough to suffer through the history of English literature, would know about them. And even if you think about Marlowe, even if you think about Johnson, how many people would know about them now? But Shakespeare is someone, even the most common person, the most common, not in any classic, I don't know what the word is, class conscious sense of the way, but even from a very academic perspective, someone who does not have a training in literature would know Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is also a school text. It's considered to be a school text, heaven knows why. But anyway, so what I think separates Shakespeare from all the others are, number one, definitely, I mean, it's not a hierarchy kind of a thing, his poetry, definitely. I mean, if you subtract the poetry from the texts, they become very ordinary texts. The anguish, the angst, the philosophical ideas that we tend to find, they are all there because of the poetry, of the depth of feeling that is there. You take that away, Macbeth becomes just a villain. You take that away, Hamlet becomes even more insufferable. So, and these close readings and the poetry, and the second thing is that these contextual readings and the connotations that he is adding, not only the denotations, but the connotations, this awareness of the possibility of other readings, the awareness of the possibility of other significations. That is what makes Shakespeare so great, because that is why he can connect to people, to audiences, to academics over time. And let me begin by talking about The Merchant of Venice. It's the most obvious choice for this discussion, because we all know during the Nazi, during the Second World War in Germany, The Merchant of Venice was a very popular play because it showed a Jewish person as the iconic villain. So The Merchant of Venice could become a part of Nazi propaganda. And even if you think about Shakespeare's times, what is very surprising is that probably in England of that time, in Renaissance England, Jews were not allowed to have home property citizenship. So Shakespeare had to take this play to Venice, where in the continent where Jews were allowed to stay. So this anti-Semitism was very much there, and I would like you to imagine that when The Merchant of Venice is being played on the Renaissance stage, people are actually cheering when a Jewish person is being punished, when a Jewish person is being insulted. So this is the other face of Renaissance. It's not, the human is not all comprehensive. The Renaissance is beginning with the colonial project. So the human, the human in that humanism is strictly a Eurocentric white Christian idea. So that is something that you need to remember. And in The Merchant of Venice, if you think about it, there are so many objections that I can raise. I mean, Antonio, I mean, yes, we understand Antonio's problem, his love for Bassanio, etc., which can never be requited. And Bassanio will never, ever understand what Antonio feels. But if Antonio is such a respected merchant, why does he have to go to Shylock to borrow money? Why not the other merchants? Why not the other people? Because Christianity did not allow lending. That is the one rationale that you might find. But they end up at Shylock's, and there is not a bit of gratitude anywhere. Even when they are asking for money, they are insulting Shylock. They are being extremely bad human beings. I mean, yes, you would say that you need to understand the racial tensions, but Do we need to understand the racial tensions? Isn't Shakespeare showing this? I mean, he's not only doing that, he's not only showing how ridiculously impolite these people are, how they are saying that even after you give us money, I will call you a car, I will spit on you, etc. They keep on doing so. But the other thing that Shakespeare is showing, that Bassanio is one of the most hateful people that you can think of. He is very proud of the fact that he has squandered all his money. He keeps on borrowing money from Antonio, knowing that Antonio will never be able to refuse him. And of course, all romantic comedy heroes are idiots. So, including somebody like Orsino. But Bassanio, and this entire thing is about money. Because Bassanio is going to, trying to marry Portia so that he can have her money. That is the primary goal. That marrying Portia will solve his financial issues. The love thing that we find is it to me it seems like an afterthought. To me it seems that Shakespeare had to include that. The debauchery of the aristocrats, the complete uselessness of a large segment of the people. This is something Shakespeare is pointing out, and we also see how worthless Bassanio is in that ring episode, where Portia, who comes as a young lawyer to the court and saves Antonio, with that again ridiculous a pound of flesh thing, he does not recognize Portia, all right. It's very difficult not recognizing somebody you love, but then he manages to do that. And he he has interactions with this young lawyer face to face, and she asks for the ring which he had promised he will never part with, and he eventually parts with it. So the question is that how come we have a hero who is such a horrible person? And coming back to Shylock, one of the celebrated scenes in the play is when Jessica runs away and Shylock is reported to be lamenting, my daughter, my ducats, my daughter, my ducats. And people say that, look, he is equating his daughter with his money. But that, if you think about it, is this does this prove that he is absolutely inhuman? Or does this look at his identity? Because he is a person who cannot have any profession. He is a person who is not allowed to live in the proper part of the city. There is a ghetto kind of a thing where he must live, the Jewish quarter where he must live. He cannot have property as much. But the only identity, the only weapon that he has is money. And when Jessica leaves with money, it's a double betrayal. She betrays him, she betrays his profession calling. So when he cries, my daughter, my ducats, it's a cry of, it's an existential crisis for him, because this is his everything. Money is his identity, money is his profession, money is his survival. And it's not out of choice that he is doing that, because by being born a Jew, he cannot have any other choice. So that kind of points to this idea that this celebration of Renaissance humanism was not quite all encompassing. There were other factors which were there. And interestingly, in the Midsummer Night's Dream, if I come to the Midsummer Night's Dream, just I'm going to talk about Midsummer Night's Dream, then I'll talk about Macbeth a little, and then just I'll mention King Lear a little, these 4 readings, and then I'll kind of fold. I know your interest will start to wane very soon. So, but the Midsummer Night's Dream is a contextual question. Because if you think about it, the Midsummer Night's Dream is constructed in such a way there is a frame, then there is the body of the play. The frame uh, shows the story of Theseus and Hippolyta, who are getting married, and the entire land is celebrating their marriage, and we are supposedly in a happy time. So, a time of revelry, a time of happiness, nuptial bliss, if one might say. And this is where Shakespeare is introducing his complicated story of love. But why the story of Theseus and Hippolyta? This is not the most ideal love story that you can find in classical mythology. Please don't think that Shakespeare did not know. I mean, it's one thing to say that Shakespeare knew little Latin and less Greek, but to completely discount his learning, these were popular learnings. So I think Shakespeare is positing the entire plot within this frame because he is trying to say something. Because the love idea that the play celebrates, Theseus is exuberant, Hippolyta is less so. And if you go back to the classical myths, then in one version, Theseus is kidnapping Hippolyta and marrying her against her wishes. Right. And Hippolyta is after that rescued by the Amazons. In another version, Theseus again marries Hippolyta by force because it was a political marriage. And Hippolyta, they were never a happy couple. And Theseus and Hippolyta have a son, but soon Theseus falls in love with Phaedra and he completely forgets Hippolyta, and Hippolyta does not have a very happy end. So this kind of a frame makes you question, why is Shakespeare locating his story within this frame, this unhappiness? Is he trying to tell you something? That all this exuberance about love does not really function. And also, if you think about it, the magic idea put inside the dream idea, the unreality of the idea is emphasized. And if you think about it, the end is where everybody is, there is a happy ending. Demetrius is falling in love with Helena under the influence of the juice of that magical flower, and Lysander and Hermia are happy. But somewhere in between, there is a very not entirely hilarious segment where both the men are vying for the affection of Helena. Puck mistakenly puts the juice of the flower on the eyes of Lysander. Lysander sees Helena, completely forgets Hermia, and both Lysander and Demetrius, they start fighting for Helena. And for Helena, it's a traumatic experience, and that is something Shakespeare has captured very well. She thinks that they are toying with her now. And it's an absolutely traumatic thing. Helena is such an interesting character. Because when you talk about love, she is the only one who is ready to sacrifice everything, even her dignity, for love. But anyway, let this not become a class on that. But the thing is, Hermia and Lysander go back together. When they erase that potion out of Lysander's eyes, it's not done so for Demetrius. But the question remains, would that last? How long would that last? It's an artificially generated solution. It's a magic solution. It's a dream solution. And these dreams do not last. And he is calling this play a Midsummer Night's Dream. So he is questioning this core value of love, which has been celebrated throughout Shakespearean sonnet, throughout Elizabethan sonnet sequences, including Shakespeare's own, which we know were more or less exercises. Shakespeare was not really. There are so many theories. Again, let me not get into that. But the thing is, he is questioning this exuberance of this human feeling called love, and he is saying that this don't be as overjoyed. Like everything else, love in A Midsummer Night's Dream is a power play. It's an equation which is completely dominated by different socio cultural factors, which has this element of power from Aegeus to Theseus to Demetrius. It's only when Demetrius says that I do not claim Hermia anymore that we can have. And this entire question of male domination. These women are all very smart, all very erudite. But again, of course, this is entirely patriarchal. Again, let me not start with that. And the one thing that I forgot to mention is when I was talking about the Merchant of Venice, this idea of race, you know why this idea came to me? Because there is this brilliant figure called the Prince of Morocco. He is absolutely right for Portia in every way. And the only reason he cannot win is because of his ethnicity. Because somebody from Morocco would probably not be allowed to, they would not be allowed to show that such a person can win a proper European woman. You know, when a Moor married an European woman, the entire Othello happened. So the race idea, the class idea, that these ideas are very, very significant. Now, let me come to Macbeth. Macbeth, as the text, there are no problems as such. There is a problem, which I will come to. But if you think about the story of Macbeth, at the end, we find status quo. Macbeth is killed and his head is severed, and we are all very happy that he is dead. Now we can breathe a sigh of relief, because however much may we have loved Macbeth, he was. You need to kind of sacrifice that figure because he is too large, much larger than life. But anyway, that's a different kind of a cathartic feeling. That's a different discussion. But the thing is, if you think about it, Malcolm will be king now. The two major male figures that we have in the opposite camp, Malcolm and Macduff. Let me just talk about Malcolm and Macduff. In one pivotal scene, truly pivotal, because it's in the center and it talks about kingship. It's one scene that we have all hated, because among all these action, this is all talk, all words, but not Hamletish words, but words which are relevant, because that is the section where the idea of the king is being.
And Macduff is talking about so many things, and Macduff is Macduff is challenging Malcolm and saying, and Malcolm is telling Macduff that I have so many vices. And after a while, Macduff for a long time, Macduff says that all right, a king is allowed to have his vices to a certain extent. A king is allowed to have his vices, but after a while, that there is a testing scene. But what Malcolm does, what I have found very interesting always, is Edward, the King of England, Edward the Confessor, who was the historical king at that time. How saintly is this man? How altruistic is this man? After all, a king is a politician. A king cannot be an ideally good person. It does not happen. If a king is an ideally good, saintly kind of a person, then he becomes Duncan. Then he should be as quickly killed as possible, because he would ruin the country as Duncan was ruining the country. But we see Edward helping Malcolm with his army, with his soldiers. Now, in that war, Malcolm has nothing. He is entirely supported by the English forces. So why is the English king so kind? Why is he helping Malcolm? Because he knows Malcolm would be in his debt. Scotland would be a country where the English army can enter invited. So a sovereign country where the soldiers from a neighboring and not, England has never been a very kind of a country. They have, I mean, if you think about it, with Malcolm, the English army entered Scotland, and they're there still. So anyway, Malcolm did try a lot, but this is what I'm talking about. Where is Malcolm's wisdom? What Duncan was trying to stop, what Macbeth helped Duncan stop, this is what he's doing. He's toying with the sovereignty of his kingdom just so that he can be king. He is welcoming the enemy inside his territories just so that he can be king. And Edward, of course, is not spending all that money, spending all what we call human resource now, just because he is a kind person who thinks that Malcolm is a good kid who should be, and who thinks that Macbeth is a bad person. It's not like that. The equation politics never happens like that. So that is one problem. But that's a contextual, that's an extra textual problem. The textual problem that I have is with Macduff. I can never really understand or celebrate Macduff. Macduff is given the holy duty of killing Macbeth because he, from his mother's womb, was untimely raped because his mother was dead when he was born. So she was not a she anymore, she was it. So not born of a woman in that sense. And we see Macduff, what surprises me is that Macduff is a part of that politics. Macduff is a part of that court. He knows how that court functions. So when Macduff is running away for no good reason as such, Macbeth has not been unkind or has not been targeting him as such. But when he runs away, does he not know that it will create suspicions which were not there? Or it will confirm suspicions if there were any? And does he not know that the practice of punishment will be on his wife and son? If he is running away, why is he not running away with his family? If he is afraid of Macbeth, why is he not afraid of the safety of his family? One of the most significant things in the text is when Macduff's son is killed on stage. One of the only severely violent acts that happens on stage, a young child being killed. We know that is done so that our sympathy will completely shift away from Macbeth. But to a certain extent, Macduff is equally responsible because he is leaving his family in danger, fully knowing what happens to people in this situation. So this is a question that I always ask, that is Shakespeare quite deliberately asking these questions? Is he leaving these clues so that even the contemporary audience can ask these questions and understand the politics? They would probably understand these more than we would appreciate this. So is that what Shakespeare is doing? And let me just talk about King Lear for 5 or 7 minutes, and then I'll round up. The thing is, King Lear, Cordelia, is the big question. Those of you who have, I think Dipayan is here and a few of my students are here. If you have a attended my classes on Bond's Lear, then you know how I feel about Cordelia. I have always thought that Cordelia is a particularly spoiled child. The innocence that we celebrate, she is a part of the court, although this is not the Mughal court sort of a thing. This is almost a tribal kind of a situation, a tribal kind of a thing. This is prehistoric Britain, where Lear is a mythical king. But the idea of power is always there. Politics does not depend on history, historical locations, or such questions. Politics is always there. Politics is always a significant part of any power structure. And so living within that power structure, if Cordelia does not know how to speak diplomatically, then it's her fault. She might be too innocent. And if you think about it, Cordelia being expelled from the court is creating a lot of difficulties because the country is now divided into two parts. These two parts, Goneril and Rhaegar, would not accept, they would share Lear for a limited period of time. Eventual problems, we all know what happens there. But if Cordelia was there, Cordelia, if she was so much if she loved her father so much, within her a third of the country, she could have allowed Lear to live, and all these difficulties would not be happening. So if she was diplomatic enough, but this is conjecture, there might have been similar problems. But what I find very, very quite objectionable is that Cordelia, after all the problems occur, after Lear is dispossessed, Lear is not dispossessed, he voluntarily abdicates. So he is a person who leaves the responsibility but wants to hold on to the power. And so he has a rude kind of an awakening that those now, the people who have power, would not like to share power with him anymore. Why should they? He has voluntarily gave them that power. So Lear's madness, everything, yes, is towering ego. That all makes sense. What does not make sense is Cordelia's attempt to rescue Lear. How does she do that? She is attacking her own country with the soldiers of her husband, who is a king of another country. Again, the idea of sovereignty. So Cordelia, if she was innocent at the beginning, is becoming a much more problematic factor at the end. In order to rescue her father, she is attacking her country. In that war, she is killing her own soldiers on either side. She has to die at the end because there is no other way how you can reconcile this problem. So Cordelia, the heart of Lear, is becoming this problematic entity politically, and the contemporary Elizabethan audience would probably ask this question: why is she attacking her own nation? Because if you go through the history plays, if you go through all the tragedies, the idea is that civil war must not happen at any cost. They have come out of a series of civil wars. They have just created a nation called England, which is enjoying power. Elizabeth has just died. Still, there is a lot of power. There is a lot of difficulty religion-wise. So, someone disrupting that. Of course, there is already civil war because Goneril and Rhaegar are not exactly very nice people. But her attack brings in a new dimension because it's a foreign intrusion. So I wonder, the question is, if Shakespeare was aware of these things, we will never know. Because we will never know if there was a Shakespeare or not. But the texts successfully carry these things. These readings are possible. I am not saying these readings are all valid. I am not claiming that these should be the readings that you should have. But this is something that I have read and a few people have read into these texts. And the thing, the connection of history is happening independent of the author. The text, with or without the brand, is connecting to history and is allowing you certain readings which are textual readings, and at certain points they are contextual readings. So in a way, these texts, this is the speciality of Shakespearean texts, that they can survive without their history and they can attach themselves to their history and give you further meanings, but they do not need to attach themselves to their author. We have always connected texts to their histories mostly through the mediation of the author. But here, when we talk about the Shakespearean brand, that mediation is no longer significant, relevant. The signification is non-existent, perhaps, and they are not only free of history, they are free of their author. You can add them to their history, but you cannot really add them to their author, because in many ways the author, Shakespeare himself, becomes a text here, a brand here, something that is worth studying by itself. So these texts, they have this unique location, and that is why I often call Shakespeare not an author, a dramatist, but this unique theoretical phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It has always been a
Modesty, thy name is Dr. Siddhartha Bishash. At the beginning, you said, I'm not so erudite, I don't have any presentation. But it's really, really wonderful. Thank you very much for your wonderful deliberation. Now I think we're ready for the questions. Over to Paramita. Over to Paramita.
Thank you, madam. Now, I would like to invite Suchishmita Datto madam to conduct the interaction session. Over to you, Suchishmita di.
Thank you, Paramita. It has always been a pleasure to listen to Siddhartha speaking, and I in particular, so many are present here have been listening to equally mesmerized since the very day. So thank you again, sir. And so we would now like to invite questions from the participants. And here the first question.
You're not audible properly. Come close to the mouth, please.
Actually, so many mouthpieces are unmuted. So here the first question from Orixi Dr. friend Orixi. I think he is asking about the device of Portia's father's will in the Merchant of Venice, and I think he's referring to it with respect with the context of Shylock's reaction with the loss of his daughter. How if Shylock is trying to control the choice of his daughter in marriage, Portia's father is equally exercising the device of will, and Orixi particularly comments that this device is an absolute farce. So would you like to elaborate on that?
It's an absolutely correct observation, Orixi. There is nothing to discuss as such, because fathers controlling the marital situations of their daughters is something that is still very much there in our in a lot of parts of our world. But here, it's an interesting connection that when Portia's father is creating this stricture that any suitor of Portia would have to go through the test, and the only one who will win will have Portia's hand. There are two functions. One is that, yes, the parental control is there, and of course that allows Bassanio to, because otherwise, as I said, the Prince of Morocco would have been quite a good candidate. And if Portia had married the Prince of Morocco, the story would have a very different kind of an ending. But the thing is, here again, it's a very good observation, because on the one hand, we have a Christian father who is allowed to control his daughter's life, and on the other hand, we have a Jewish father who is not allowed to control his daughter's life. And the fact that his daughter rebels, runs away, is celebrated. So there is this kind of double standard that we can see. Just because Shylock is not Christian, he does not even have the right to control, or I mean, I will use the word control. Whether that's right or wrong is a different question, but control his daughter's life. So it's a very interesting observation. It's something that Shakespeare may have had his, I don't know, maybe it was there in his mind. But the two fathers and the two daughters, that equation is very important. Thank you, Orithrik, for this particular observation.
Sir, the next question we have from Brinda Shamanto, and she is talking about the character of Macbeth as it has been portrayed through the character of Makbul in the film Makbul. So that is a question. So do you think that the character of Macbeth has somehow been demanded in the film?
I'm sorry, I could not get the last section of the character of Macbeth has been
demanded in the film. So I think
no, it's demeaned. Demeaned.
Demeaned. Sorry. Yes. If I may call you Brinda, this is the point, because see, Macbeth was a great soldier. He has ambition. He kills his king, which is a great sin. And finally, he returns to the fold of the soldier. He leaves his borrowed clothes and wears the soldier's mantle, and he refuses to give up. That is where he becomes the tragic hero, the tragic grandeur he attains. And it can happen because he was a good person to begin with, who was corrupted. But Makbul was already corrupted. By the time we enter the narrative of Makbul, the figure of Makbul is a corrupted figure. He is by no means a figure whom you can support. He is an extortionist, a murderer, an antisocial in every sense of the term. So he can fall from that. So in a way, Bharadwaj is reinventing Macbeth in a way which I would probably not use the word demean here, because the contexts and the ideas of right and wrong, morality, that has changed a lot over the years. Our culture is much more open to what was considered to be sinful or negative at one point of time. So that way, Makbul functions in a different narrative and moral framework, where his fall happens within that moral framework, the honor among thieves kind of a thing, that he shows no honor, he has no honor. So in that way, Makbul is different, but what Makbul can never be is a tragedy. That way, there is a step down. And as I said, I think that is the point Bharadwaj is trying to make, that in our society, in our value systems, in our philosophical atmosphere, we can't really have tragedy anymore. I hope that answers your question.
I apologize to you, Brinda, for misreading your question. So we move on to the next question. It is from Shayanti Shaha. Shayanti Shaha from what she has written, she wants to know about the dramatic portrayal of the character of Orlando in Twelfth Night, of course.
Not
So
in
she
12th
wants
Night,
to know
as you
your
like
point
it.
of view.
Orlando in As You Like It.
Oh, sorry. Orsino in
So,
Twelfth Night.
Orsino in 12th Night. Orlando is a wonderful person, isn't he? I mean, he is a wrestler. I mean, not that we are against wrestlers. So many Khans are pretending to be wrestlers these days. So wrestlers are quite popular. So he is a wrestler and he is a poet. And he writes poetry and he paints them on the trees and etc. And the quality of his poetry is never commented upon. I am quite sure that we would not like to read his poetry as such. But he is a simpleton. In a way, it's the women characters in the romantic comedies who are much better, who are the movers of the text, who wear the clothes of, because that was a very popular trope, a very popular strategy at that time. So in a way, Orlando, like all other romantic shows, are worked upon rather than they do anything, not a little, because they have some power which these women do not have, like Orsino in Twelfth Night. But these women, they suffer through everything, they move through the narrative, they carry a lot of the plot. And the heroes, they remain very good people, but they are intellectually always much less than the heroines, the women protagonists. So Orlando falls into that formula completely. I hope that's enough.
Sir, the next question is from Ombika Boirabro. She asks, uh, how was Duncan ruining his country as he was saying, please?
Okay, how was Duncan ruining his country? See, if a king is strong, then a kingdom is also strong. Then a kingdom uh, flourishes. King is weak, then everybody from around would start to attack. They would want to annex. And if you remember, when Macbeth is opening, we have uh, one thin uh, rebelling, which is almost impossible to think of. We have one king invading, and we see that Duncan's army essentially is almost defeated. It's the valor of Macbeth and Banquo which saves the day. Right. And the Thane is killed, and Duncan immediately says that I will go and live, spend the night at your house. And the thing is, the other thing which is very important is that there are two rules of uh, dynasty. One is progeny, one is tanistry. In one, it's a succession through the family. The king's son would, the king's elder son would become king. And in the other rule, it's the most uh, able man, the most deserving man who would become king. And there is no question that in this kingdom, Macbeth is the most deserving. And Scotland had that system of tanistry at that time. And but Duncan is blind to this fact. Duncan is blind to this fact that Macbeth is would make a good king. Macbeth did in history. Macbeth was a very good king for 10 or such years. And he is also blind to the fact that Macbeth wants to be king badly. As a king, he is supposed to understand, he is supposed to read, because as when I was talking about King Lear, as I said, the king is supposed to be completely familiar with the politics and the power equations all around him. If he is not aware of that, then he is failing as a king because it's his responsibility. He is the country. by Elizabethan standards and by earlier standards, the king is the country. That is why the king would say we, the royal plural, because the king is no longer an individual. So when he is becoming blinded by the love of his son and is unable to see what Macbeth is, that is also another failure. Along with the attacks on his country and this error of judgment, Duncan proves that he is not that good a king. I hope that is enough.
Sir, the next question is from Somodi Tarokdar, and he again connects us to the eternal question of destiny and free will. He wants to know how far Macbeth had a choice in his downfall.
All right. See, the way I look at it, he wants to be king. He has the essential qualifications, let's say. He has been winning wars for Duncan for a long time without, with recognition, but that recognition is not much. The ambition is something that he recognizes in himself, and he knows that Lady Macbeth is also ambitious. And while returning from the battlefield, he meets the witches who prophesies that Macbeth will be king. Now, if you have a prophecy that you would be king, you do not need to commit murder. You just sit back, relax, and you would be king because there is a prophecy. So the circumstances will make you king because of the prophecy. You don't have to go and murder the Duncan. So that is where the choice element comes, because he wants to be king now. He doesn't want to wait because he was in line. He was 13th in line or something like that, if I remember. But he doesn't want to wait. So that is the choice. To commit the crime is the choice. Right. And that is why he is he is not Oedipus, where Oedipus is the person who truly does not have a choice. But in a way, Macbeth does have a choice. But thank you for this question.
And there is Tirthankar Sengupta, and from his long question, as far I can gather, is that there is a kind of usability that is happening throughout the place, and
I'm sorry, somebody else is it's disrupting. I cannot hear the question.
Sir, is it audible now?
Yes, Shuchishmita, please.
Yes, sir. Tirthankar Sengupta has asked that there is an uniqueness of sensibility that is palpable throughout the Shakespearean plays, and the contemporary reality has been played with in a very subtle way. So all these points, according to him, and what he wants to say is that all these points point to the fact that Shakespeare actually existed, that these are all the products of a single man's thought, and that man is Shakespeare.
This is, but it's definitely the product of one man's thought, but that man may not have been Shakespeare. I mean, conspiracy theory wise. That man may have been anything, and that man may have been called something else. Shakespeare, and remember, why did Shakespeare write What's in a Name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So that name thing was something that Shakespeare was thinking about. And Shakespeare may have been just a kind of a front. But the unique sensibility, yes, in many ways, not only the unique sensibility, but you can see the progression of that sensibility from the early half-baked plays, which are not very good. I'm sorry, I mean, I'll probably be crucified for saying so. And then you come to the mature romantic tragedies and romantic comedies first, then romantic tragedies. And from to the dark comedies, the development of the mind can be clearly seen. These are not separate senses. You are absolutely right. But the point is this that Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon? Or is this other collaborative effect or somebody else? Some people say Marlowe, he became Shakespeare. But there are theories. But the point is, we don't really need Shakespeare here. As long as we have all these as long as we have all these possibilities of readings connected with history, disconnected with history, these texts can survive without the so-called author. That was the point, essentially.
Sir, now the last question is from Rajesh Patro, and he wants you to comment about the portrayal of Jessica in Merchant of Venice, about the ambivalent presentation of Jessica in Merchant of Venice.
All right, because Jessica is tremendously significant because Jessica shows this helplessness. Why does Jessica want to marry a Christian? Whoever that person is. Why does she want to marry a Christian? Is it only because her father is a tyrant, a bully, a bad man, a villain, etc., a regular, typical Hindi film Amrish Puri kind of a figure? Or is it because she wants to get away from the stigma of being Jewish and she wants to become a part of the mainstream, a part of the center? She does not want to be marginalized anymore. The only way she has this option, the only way she can do this is by marrying a Christian, and she knows she will be lauded for marrying a Christian. The entire state structure would be tremendously happy with her because she has left her religion and taken another religion. She has actually, well, I almost used a very problematic contemporary term, but I'm not going to use it. But that, I think, is the idea behind it. She thinks she is in love. I'm not saying that she is a conniving kind of a person. She thinks she is very much in love. But there is this element that she is in love with a Christian, not with a Jewish boy. Right. So I kind of read Jessica in that way. I hope that answer satisfied you.
Thank you, sir. Since there is no more.
And
Thank
now
you,
we
sir.
come. Okay. So
Now I will. Thank you for clearing all our doubts and answering all the questions. I would now invite Ismail ma'am to take over. Kindly take over.
Thank you, Sujit.
hello.
Thank you, Smita Ji. And thank you, Professor Dr. Siddhartha Bishas sir, for the wonderful session, really enriched and enlightened. So we have reached almost the end of our webinar. Now I cordially welcome Muhammad Fazli Alam, Assistant Professor of English of Shakespearean College, and request to deliver vote of thanks. Alumda, please begin it.
Am I audible?
Yes.
So thank you all. Respected Principal Madam, honorable speakers, and all the participants. This is a great privilege for me to deliver vote of thanks on this great occasion. I, on behalf of the Department of English, Shriram Girls College, would like to convey our heartfelt thanks and gratitude to our honorable speakers, Professor Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta and Professor Dr. Siddhartha Bishas for their illuminating lectures. We have greatly been enriched and enlightened by their lectures. We want to extend our sincerest thanks and gratitude to both of them because despite their tough schedule, they have managed their valuable times for this webinar. I also want to convey our sincerest thanks and gratitude to our Honorable Principal Madam for her support and cooperation for conducting this program. We are also grateful to our AQSC coordinator, Dr. Shayanti Talukdar, and TCS of our college, Dr. Bimal Mondal, for inspiring us and supporting us in all possible ways. We are also thankful to the convener of our webinar committee, Dr. Shampar Sarkar, and all the members associated with this committee for their enormous cooperation. We are also grateful to Dr. Sandip Majumdar for helping us in preparing the brochure, and we are grateful to Mr. Devkanti Das and Dr. Sandip Majumdar for their technical assistance. And on behalf of the department, again, I thank all the faculty members, students, and research scholars of other institutions and the students of our college for their active participation. And I also want to thank those who have asked relevant questions showing their interest to the topic. So thank you all. And it was really a great teamwork. So on behalf of the faculty members of my department, I would like to thank our head of the department, Professor Dr. Suranjana Bhadra, for her great enthusiasm, valuable suggestion and proper guidance. And we are also grateful to the senior-most professor of our department, Professor Dr. Sharmishta Moitro, for her proper guidance, valuable suggestions to make this program a grand success. So again, I thank you all for your active participation and your patience to make this event a grand success. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I therefore declare
Shuranjan.
Hello.
Yes.
You're audible. Please.
I therefore declare the closing of the webinar. Let's call it a day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Shuranjana. Thank you. Thanks to the department. And Shormishta, thank you so much.
Oh, I'm not audible. You're welcome, Shida.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please mute your audio, all of you.